The Howard County Conservancy presents An Evening of Storytelling, 2018.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Meg Boyd. I'm Executive Director here at the Conservancy, and what a pleasure to see a packed house on such a rainy, rainy night. Thank you all for coming out. I usually, when it's a beautiful day, I tell everyone it's always pleasant at Mount Pleasant, but I don't think I can use that line tonight. So we really appreciate you braving the rain to come out tonight and join us for the storytelling program. We are in for a treat tonight with this lineup of storytellers. I'm very excited. And as I was thinking about this program, I was thinking about the Conservancy's mission. And I think a lot of you know that environmental education is part of our mission. Modeling responsible stewardship is part of our mission. But another part of our mission is preserving the land and its legacy. And it's really that legacy piece that is such a beautiful fit for tonight's program. Whether the stories are about nature or about Howard County or just about people's lives, they're really that legacy piece of our program. So we're thrilled to have another successful year of the storytelling program. And I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsors, Howard County Recreation and Parks, and the Columbia Association, and Beth Wynn, who is with REMAX 100. So we thank them for their financial support. And then I also wanted to thank our tireless program committee. Anyone who has seen what we do behind the scenes here knows that we really rely on our volunteers. And our program committee is incredible. The time and the energy that they give to planning events like tonight. So if those that are here could stand, I'd like to thank them. We have Audrey Schur, who is our chair of our program committee. Wendy Ng. Oh, there's Wendy. Lisa Schlossnagel is in the back. Kimberly Dorsey-Bronow is here. And Kathy Tillman put a ton of energy in tonight's program, but I understand her preference was to babysit her sweet little grandson tonight. So, so that's Lee's fault that Kathy is not with us here tonight. And I think, did I get everyone from the program committee who's here? And I will also mention that while they were planning this program, they were also coming up with the full schedule of our 2019 programs. So it was an especially busy month for the program committee. And with that, I am going to hand the mic over to Ned, who will kick off our program.
Thank you, Meg. And that was a suggestion that we all silence our cell phones so we don't interrupt the program. Hi, I'm Ned Tillman. I really appreciate you coming out tonight. It's, it's kind of a dark and stormy night. What a wonderful night for some stories. I just want to comment that Meg and her staff do a wonderful job here. So let's give her a round of applause. I also want to say that back in 1992, Senator Jim Clark invited me to go for a drive one day, and we came out here, and I fell in love with this place, Mount Pleasant. And I've spent a lot of my time in the last 20 years, or 30 years, I guess, out here, and I really enjoy it. And the one thing I remember about Senator Clark was he wasn't a man of many words, but he always had a good story. And we really like to remember our ancestors and those who came before us and the great stories they told. And I'm really looking forward to this evening and these 12 new storytellers and what they have to share with us. Tonight, as the last 3 years, the program will be facilitated by Lee Tillman. She's worked with these 12 storytellers over the last 6 weeks with a workshop and then and coaching. And so to give a little background, Lee, she is a product of the Howard County Public School System. She went away and studied creative writing and anthropology, and then she traveled for about 10 years, hitchhiking around the universe. And then she settled down, and she's made a career out of facilitating groups for all sorts of purposes. But certainly she's developed the storytelling process to help people tell their stories better to each other. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Lee up.
Good evening. It's such a treat to be here with you all this evening. And as my dad said, with the darker evenings coming and the shorter days and the chill that makes you kind of want to hunker down, it's the season of stories. And so it's been such an honor to work with these folks over the past few weeks as that shift happens in preparation of tonight. And I think about folks all around the world, throughout history, throughout different cultures and climes, kind of gearing up for that, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, at the same time, sort of getting ready to take the time to linger in one another's stories. So this evening we have 12 storytellers who courageously and generously are going to share parts of their lives with us. And in October, beginning of October, we got together and we put out this theme of sense of place, sense of home here. And over the last month on calls with all of these folks, we have gone there with the sense of home really strongly. I've been thinking about it a lot, getting to be in connection with folks here. I live in Maine currently. So tonight's really an invitation to show up and hear these stories, the ones that will be filling the room. And also being curious about the folks sitting maybe to your right and your left, and what stories are coming up for them around the sense of home. And then finally, noticing what's arising in you. And when Randy mentioned something about a certain road in this county, and you think, one time when I was on that road, tending to those stories too. Sound good? Okay. We will hear 6 of the storytellers, then we'll have an intermission, and then we'll hear the second set of 6. And the one other thing I'll say is, even though we've been working over the last month on these stories and practicing them and memorizing parts, I really believe a story is also an occasion. So I don't know what they're going to do when they get up here, and they only have a slight inclination of what they're planning to do. But it's really about this moment, all of us together, these stories jumping in this room. So thank you for being here to be a part of these stories. And with no further ado, we are going to start with Randy Nixon. Randy is an attorney currently working for the Hogan administration. He has lived his entire life at the historic Nixon's farm on Route 32 in West Friendship, managing the family's business enterprises. He has been married to Jennifer Nixon for 35 years, and their greatest accomplishments are Blair and Spencer, ages 29 and 25. Will you please put your hands together and welcome Randy on up here?
First one up, no pressure, right? This is called A Place for the Rest of Us. The Nixon family served the Howard County community for 62 years as an event facility. And we did a number of things, one of which was produce the greatest fried chicken on earth, which came from my mother's recipe. And the other thing is that we did something which is a great legacy to the county. We preserved the farm. You know it now as the biggest private solar project in the county. But the origins of it started in a barber shop in Baltimore. My mother was a barber, having graduated from Colored High School number 43 in Charlotte, North Carolina. And she was the only woman working in a barber shop off of Pennsylvania Avenue and Linwood Street in Baltimore. And a pretty woman barber in 1948 seemed to attract a lot of attention because apparently there weren't very many women barbers. And one of the people that she attracted was my dad. And my dad had just been discharged from the Navy. He said he'd fought the Japanese in front of him and the white man behind him for the last 7 years. He was a non-commissioned officer in the Navy, and back at a time when there were virtually no black non-commissioned officers, and he quite literally had to fight his way across the Pacific. So it wasn't a metaphor for him. It was something that was very real. And at the time, when fighters were put together, they were matched. If they had a black fighter, they would pair him with a fighter of a heavier weight class. So he found himself as a middleweight, fighting welterweights and even heavyweights. So my dad walked into the barber shop, and there were 6 barber chairs, and there was only one chair that was open, and that was my mother's chair. 6 weeks later, he asked her to marry him. He was a man of real conviction. And he did very well financially. He bought into a chain of grocery stores, and that also served convenience and manners and liquor. And my mother wanted to buy a farm. She hungered for land. And they looked at every other county in what later became the metropolitan area. It wasn't called back then. And they found that Howard County was the only county that did not have racial covenants. And so they decided that they wanted to be in a county that was more enlightened. And so they decided to come to Howard County. And my dad's business partner was Jewish. And they applied for membership in the Baltimore Chamber of Commerce. And this now sounds like a bad joke. You know, a black guy and a Jewish guy are walking to the Chamber of Commerce. And they obviously got laughed out. And they decided that they were going to start their own Chamber of Commerce. And so they started meeting in the storefront. And they outgrew that very quickly. And then someone said, Nick, and that's my dad's nickname, and my son's nickname as well. And they said, Nick, why don't we do a party out at your barn? So Dad cleared out the barn, and it was truly a barn. And he put in a floor and invited everybody out. He got some scotch from the storeroom and a bunch of cigars and invited everyone out. And Mother looked back at the cars on Route 40 and looked at about 40 cars that were coming out to the farm. And she said, oh my God, someone has to cook for all those people. So that's how the catering business got started. And so it was a kind of mishmash. It was blacks and Jews and Lithuanians and recent immigrants, Nigerians, Gentiles. And they got together and they formed a business club. And they called themselves the Hebrews. and it was a motley group of folks. So you had this, I mean, it looked like a Barry Levinson film. You had this motley group of people, a rainbow, coming out to Howard County in the 1950s. And it was a unique environment. My dad set up a driving range and a putt-putt, and the men would play golf and drink scotch and smoke cigars. The women would play cards. And we kids would play. We'd play on the hay bales, and we would play in the stream, and we would play in the woods. And we had no idea that this was something that other kids didn't do. And the thing that came through to me in retrospect was what humanists my parents were. There's a sort of implicit understanding that people of color have, that it's okay to be racist toward other people, but we can excuse that in ourselves, but not in others. And my parents drove that out of me. And they said that you have to be a respecter of persons. You have to love everybody. And I remember, this is early 60s, during the height of the civil rights struggle. And I remember looking at pictures of protests for anti-integration protests. And I said, Mom, what's going on there? Why is it that people don't want to get together? And why do I see so much hatred? And she said, let me take you, the next time we go to the shopping center, look at all the small acts of grace and of kindness that people do for each other every day. Even people who are biased, even people who might have prejudice, they have a certain politeness about them. And observe that and appreciate that. So Dad was doing very well financially, and they decided to build a fancy house, what we would now call a McMansion. And my mother had heard about a very good interior decorator. And so she invited him out. He had no idea that we were black. And she showed this very fancy house that had been featured in Architectural Digest and Better Homes and Gardens. And he said, Mrs. Nixon, I'm sorry. I can't do this. I've had a very bad experience with Negroes, and I just can't accept this commission. And my mother said, well, let me show you what I want to do with the curtains over here. And at the end of the session, she handed him a check, and she said, when you're finished with this, come back and we'll talk some more. 20 years later, my brother went to pick up some cushions from this man's shop, and he said to my brother, your mother changed my life. She would not accept my prejudice, and I appreciate that. So, about 10 years later, a group of people came, young people, and they said, we'd like to have a party, but we need exclusivity on the farm because we're different. And back then, different meant LGBTQ. And they said, will you accept us? And she says, God is no respecter of persons. If you don't fit in anywhere else, you fit in here. And they came for the next 30 years. So every family business is loved, hated, and argued over endlessly. And so we went through the process of building the business. I took the business from about $250,000 to about $2 million. And then we hit what was known as the Great Recession. And life got tough. And the farm became a place of struggle, whereas before it was a place of great joy. And the thing that I find remarkable is how resilient my mother was, and how much she continued to be relentlessly optimistic, even in the face of several strokes that debilitated her. And one day, and it was a cold November day, it was about to snow, and she had wheeled herself out onto the southern patio, and she said, I think I'm ready to let go. I said, what do you mean? She said, I think about all the people that we served and what this place means to the county. And we were about to put the solar panels up, 15,000 solar panels. And she said, I'm saying goodbye to all of those people that we took care of. So it was a profound experience to have gone through that process with my parents. And she always said that Nixon's Farm was always the place that was home to everyone. This was a special place for the rest of us. Thank you.
So as we soak that story in, we're going to add another layer from Gregory Seidman. Gregory was born and raised in Columbia. His children now attend the same public schools that he did. His vocation and passion is software development, which he currently applies in improving healthcare providers' access to complete patient health records. This is his first public performance since elementary school.
So I grew up in Columbia. I grew up a bit south of the mall, on the west side of 29. That helps you picture it a little bit. And I didn't really understand Columbia when I was young. It was just the place where I lived. But I had this map of Columbia. I remember it a little vaguely. I remember that it was printed in shades of brown for some reason. And I remember that it had these dashed lines on it, which I always figured were bike paths because I spent so much time biking on the bike paths around. I knew all the trees along the bike paths. I knew every spot where the roots had broken through the asphalt. I knew all the turns. I knew how to get to that street, even if I didn't really know where that street was. I at least knew how to get there and get back. And I loved biking. And sometime, I think I was maybe 13 or 14, I went on a bike ride. My parents were out somewhere. I decided that I was going to go and explore one of those bike paths on the map that I didn't really know about. And okay, honestly, I was a teenager and I kind of wanted to go to the mall. So I picked a particular dashed line that would get me to the mall, and I put the map in my back pocket. I don't remember exactly what time of year. It must have been warm enough that I was willing to go biking and not so hot that I was still willing to go biking. And I went off. I went along some streets that I knew, and I went a little farther along streets that I didn't know so well, and checked the map from time to time. Went a little farther, got to an intersection I wasn't entirely expecting, went a little farther, went way farther than I expected to go to get to that particular bike path and never saw a bike path. And I stopped at one point and looked up at the street sign of the little cul-de-sac that I was at and tried to find it on the map, and I couldn't find it. It was nowhere. I was sure that I was in one particular area of the map, and I was completely off base. So I went a little farther and checked another street name, and still didn't find it. And I turned around and checked a street on the other side to see if maybe I could find that. And I heard someone call my name, which was a little surprising. This was not just, "Oh, hey, Greg, how are you?" This was my mother calling out from the car. There were my parents. My mother was a little surprised, a little concerned. I explained that I was headed to the mall, and for those of you who remember how the roads were way back, I had gone across 29 on Owen Brown Road and was way away from the mall and anywhere I'd intended to go. So my parents had me put my bike in the trunk and hop in the car. We went home, and no harm done. Just maybe that crossing 29 on my bike wasn't the best idea. But when I got home, I asked my dad to show me how I had messed this up. How had I arrived there when I thought I was going to the mall? And we looked at the map together, and I said, I was trying to follow this path here. And he points to the legend of the map and says, those dashed lines aren't bike paths, those are planned roads. Those are roads that don't exist yet. So I had an adventure, got home safely, learned something about actually reading a map. And I also learned something about Columbia, that it wasn't just, the bike paths that I knew and the streets that I was always on, but there were plans for how this was going to grow and where things were going to, and that eventually I would be able to get to the mall that way.
When Gregory first told that to the group of us, and he mentioned the bike paths and trying to get to the mall, the number of us who were like, oh, yeah, tried that. Thank you, Gregory. Our next story is by Pauline Phillips, whose name I had heard for years. And it was such an honor to get to work with you during this time, Pauline. She's been a resident of Howard County for almost 25 years, 21 of which she's been a counselor at Oakland Mills High School. She loves to cook, much to the delight of her husband, Randy, their 2 adult children, and their 2 grandchildren. Please welcome Pauline up here.
So sometime this summer, I started to notice that there were dead trees everywhere. Many of my neighbors had to have trees removed from their properties, and I saw work crews removing dead trees from along the roads. In the woods behind my home and in Patapsco Park, I saw many tree trunks lying on the ground. I became somewhat alarmed because this seemed so widespread and because none of the people I spoke to about it seemed to have any answers. It soon became an obsession to find out what someone was not telling us about what was happening to our trees. It was in the moment that I first became conscious that I thought of them as our trees, that I realized how Howard County, how deeply Howard County had seeped into my being. That our trees spoke volumes and explained why all our grand schemes for a retirement home elsewhere have trickled like sand through my fingers. It told me in no uncertain terms that Howard County had become a home. But I didn't arrive at that aha moment simply because of dead trees. There were capstone moments along the way where I failed to recognize exactly what was happening. 25 years ago, we made a decision to move our family from a small, very non-diverse college town in Massachusetts to a more diverse environment where our children could feel validated and accepted and get a good education. Once they finished school and had taken their place in the world, then their parents could move back to the Caribbean or anywhere else their hearts desired. My first introduction to Howard County was its trees. No, I'm not an environmentalist. One of the other storytellers thought that was what my story was about. Early in 1993, we spent a weekend in Gaithersburg with friends, and we asked for directions to Columbia because my husband's company had offered an opportunity to transfer here. We were told that on our way back to Massachusetts that Sunday afternoon, if we got off the Beltway onto 29, we would pass through Columbia on our way to pick up 95. When we got home that night, I called my friends and said, I'd done exactly what I was directed to do and totally missed Columbia. All we had seen were trees along 29, where we were told Columbia would be. Oh, how they laughed, just as you are laughing now, because we had totally missed the city behind the trees. Now, I didn't get to the place where I recognize Howard County as home because of its trees, but because of those moments along the way when this county embraced me and my family. I'm going to share a couple of those moments with you. A few months after moving to Howard County, I was offered a job in a very unconventional way to be a counselor at Oakland Mills High School, nicknamed Home. That's how the staff and students for Oakland Mills High School write home. One year, we had a brutal winter, and schools were closed for over a week, while the county slowly moved mountains of snow from school parking lots and neighborhoods. When the announcement was made that schools would reopen, we panicked, because although the snow had been cleared from our parking lot, the sidewalks and pathways around our school had not been touched, and many of our students were walkers. I remember thinking how unsafe that would be for our students. And anybody who knows me knows that I would jump into action right away, which is what I did, and I organized a snow removal effort for the day before we were scheduled to reopen. When we met for work that morning, I was overwhelmed by the number of staff members, students, parents, and even neighbors who had no children in the school had turned up with their shovels for the task. Councilman Calvin Ball got wind of it and turned up with his shovel and with lunch for everyone. A camera crew from WBAL turned up to record and applaud what was happening. I looked at all those folks and understood in that moment why Oakland Mills was home and would remain so, not just for the 21 years I worked there, but even after I retired. The second moment I want to share began with an announcement in April of 2002. I was holding a department meeting, and our daughter was sitting in her AP chemistry class when the principal announced that our graduation would take place at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening. What time is it now? Our daughter had worked hard to achieve a goal she had set herself to graduate #1 in her class. But she was also a very strict Sabbath keeper and did not participate in secular activities on Friday night. A hush fell over our meeting. The same hush had fallen over her classroom. But by the time I got to the door, the teacher and the students were discussing the issue and asking her what she was going to do. She came out and informed me that she was fine. She was okay with missing her high school graduation. That was when a community of teachers, students, and parents decided that if she would not fight for herself, they would fight so Howard County Public Schools would end its Friday night graduations beginning with hers. They made her feel like she and the hard work she had put in really mattered. One of our storytellers finally answered my questions and told me what the emerald ash borer has done to our trees. It took what happened to our trees this summer to bring me to the realization that I need look no further for my place called home.
Our next layer is brought by Monsignor Richard Tillman, who I have the honor of calling Uncle Dick. He retired after 35 years with St. John's Roman Catholic Church in Wild Lake. He golfs, plays tennis, and fishes when not conducting services. Please welcome Uncle Dick up here.
Thanks, Lee. We have the same DNA. Monsignor, it's French for my lord. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, please don't call me that. I graduated high school in 1957 at Towson. That year we put on the play Our Town by Thornton Wilder. There's a scene in Our Town in which Emily implores the stage manager whether she might return to the land of the living from the land of the dead so that she might relive her 12th birthday. He agrees, but it doesn't take long for Emily to find out that she is very disappointed. What she envisioned was not what she saw. And before she leaves, she offers, too loud? Not too loud, too soft. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, sorry. But it doesn't turn out the way Emily had envisioned. And so before she leaves, she offers her farewell to the world. "O earth, you're too wonderful for anyone to realize," she says in awe, and then wonders aloud to the stage manager. "Do any human beings ever realize life while they live it, every minute?" His wistful reply, "No, saints and poets maybe, they do some." Well, I think we're all saints and poets, and my story, I hope, tries to teach that. It was February the 18th, 2001, February the 18th, 2001. The scene was 5593 Suffield Court in Columbia. It's a little kind of open space cul-de-sac. Mike Hickey lived there, Liz Bobo lives there. That's where Jim Kiesel and I were living at the time, February the 18th. 2 weeks before that, January the 28th, 2001, the Ravens had won the Super Bowl, beating the Giants 24-7. It was their first Super Bowl win with the likes of Trent Dilfer, Jonathan Ogden, Jamal Lewis, Ray Lewis, Kamal Quadri Ishmael. There are probably not a whole lot of folks remember those names, but for Ravens fans, maybe so. So we had planned a Super Bowl party on that day, but that day was on the East Coast a blizzard. Snow covered everything on that Super Bowl. The Super Bowl was in Tampa, Florida, and in Columbia, Maryland, there was no transportation. People couldn't get around. So the Super Bowl party that Jim Kiesel and I had planned was a dud. Nobody could get around. So we planned 3 weeks later to have a non-Super Bowl party. And we got all the things that we'd originally planned. We had gone to the Mexican market and got a turkey and other kinds of exotic things that were there. We got a couple rabbits, I think, and some oysters and some different things that probably didn't appear too regularly on the menu in our place. And we had about 17 people come to the party, and it was going very well. The one thing that Jim wanted to do was to have this deep fat fryer that would cook a turkey in 15 minutes. You had to get the fryer and get 16 gallons of peanut oil with a propane stove underneath and get that oil bubbling up so that it would it would cook this turkey in 15 minutes. Well, everybody was having a fun time, and somebody looked up back and says, there's something coming up. It looked like smoke coming from outside. So Jim and I went down, and the propane stove had kind of leaped up over the canister, and the oil was bubbling up and leaping over the sides, and it was boiling hot. And he tried to get the top back on the canister, but failed miserably to get it there. And we realized that we were in trouble, so we issued the alert, fire propane. And 15, 17 people exited the house quickly. We knocked on the doors on the people on either side and got them to get out. The houses were built with firewalls, so we were hopeful that things wouldn't go up completely around the neighborhood. The fire department finally came. They came pretty soon, but it seemed like hours when we were standing there watching the house go up in flames. The woman next door on the north side was older, and we thought upstairs, and we said, well, how are we going to get her out? Luckily, when we opened the door, she was right there, and we were able to get her out. The fire department came, and they started treating the house. The hoses kind of fired up from the houses, and suddenly they stopped. The chief, I said to the chief, what's the matter? He said, one of our men is down. He went into the front door and fell through to the basement, and we're trying to get him on his headset. And it was a Mayday situation. He wasn't coming to. He was unconscious. I learned later on, after talking to him later on, that he saw a bright light at the back of the house and ran for it, and his fellow firemen saw him scoot out the back and down the bank and behind the house, and they could begin then to go back and start to put the fire out. They put the fire out after it seemed like a long, long time. And the man who had been unconscious came up to me with a Bible. It was all charred, and he said, can I have this? And I said, well, let me get you a clean one. Let me get you one that's really, you can read. He said, no, I want this one. I want this one. I said, you got it. It's all yours. And so he took it. Things happened around that moment that I'm only kind of unpacking years and years from that time. The Red Cross came and took us, Jim and I, in and said, what can we do for you? And we said, well, we haven't got a place to stay. He said, okay, we'll take care of that. We'll put you up at the Sheridan. The clothes on our back is what we wore for the next 2 or 3 days. And I remember Ed Kalaki, a priest that used to help us out, came by 3 or 4 days after this all up, and had gone to the Walmart and got all these clothes for us, sweat clothes, socks, pants, and we were oversupplied by Ed's generosity. But there was a great sense of something was happening here, that the catastrophe was forgotten. A friend of mine, a priest friend of mine, said, Dick, you're going to come out this much better off than you ever realize. You're much better off. A few days after the fire, I got a call from a woman who identified himself as the wife of the fireman who had fell through the floor, and they thought it was going to be in real trouble. She said, you gave him a Bible. And I said, yeah, I gave him a charred one. I felt bad of giving us old smoked up Bible. I wanted to give him a new one. She said, well, you probably don't understand. I said, I don't, tell me. She said, he came home, and for that time on, he's been kind of a changed man. He's a better father, a better husband. The guy was probably very good to start with, but something happened, and he kind of turned a corner in terms of relationships and with his family, his wife. That story made the flyer that next couple weeks with that story in it, and I think that speaks to me too. I think something happened in me because of that event. I think it's similar to what happened to him, that there were things going on beyond our control, but somehow it ended up with a great deal of grandeur. I'm going to close with this quote from Joseph Campbell. It tries to get at the point I'm wanting to make about living every moment, living this moment. Do we really appreciate life as it really is? And sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. But sometimes when we don't, there's a change that helps us become even better than what we expected we could be. this is a quote, "We must be willing to let go of the life we've planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us." I think there are at least 3 or 4 people here were in that house that night. Raise your hand. Thank you all very much.
Our next layer is by Anne Stroziek. She is a wife, a mother, a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a great aunt, and a cousin. She loves to be outside, and when she's not, she wishes she was outside. She is a science liaison between the Conservancy and the public school system. Please welcome Anne up.
My father left us. My father left us. I was in 5th grade at Athelton Elementary, and it broke me and my siblings. I'm the youngest of 7. So in the coming days and weeks and months, we definitely got through it. And some of my siblings went off to college, and some got married, and some went in the service. But I was really left with one sibling, my brother Leo. And while he was not my father, he became such a mentor in my life. He was the one that would help tutor me with my math homework, or if I was having friend issues, he would walk me through it. He was just always there. So we became very close over the next few years. And when I was in 7th grade, I was at Hammond Middle. That Christmas, my brother gave me the coolest gift. I opened it up, and it was one of those Christmas necklaces. And it had a black string with the Christmas bulb lights, red, yellow, green. Very simple, not flashy, much like my brother Leo. Not that he's simple, but he's a very calm, he's very introverted, but someone that you can always count on. He's always there. So fast forward, many, many years later, I'm happily married to my husband, Warren, and I am expecting my 2nd child. It's in the winter time. And we had this tradition, well, not me, but him and his friends, his triathlete group. They would work out for hours and hours, and they would meet afterwards at the Bagel Bin at Wild Lake. So I would tag along. And I got to know one of his friends. Her name was Betsy. And we found out that winter that Betsy was also pregnant. Betsy was having a boy, just like I was having a boy. Betsy was having a boy the same week in August that I was having a boy. So while Betsy and I were not very close, we became a little bit closer, and we're still casual friends, but we began to talk on the phone every couple of weeks. How you doing? How you feeling? And just kind of trading stories. But then I got a terrible, terrible phone call that Betsy lost her baby. And for those of you who've been pregnant, you're just vulnerable, but especially when someone that you know is pregnant at the same time, you feel it in a very deep way. So while we still continued our phone calls, they weren't congratulatory phone calls, but consoling phone calls. So I did have my wonderful son in August, and he's now 15. And I didn't see Betsy for several months until Christmas time. We used to host an annual Christmas party, and my husband would cook red beans and rice and gumbo and all these really delicious foods. And so our old friends, triathlon friends, and other friends started walking in the door. And I went over to Betsy, and even before I began to talk with her, I could feel her sadness. So I took off my necklace that I had worn every year since 7th grade, and I gave it to her, and I said, I hope this necklace brings you a little smile this season. So a couple days later, as we're wrapping presents and getting ready for the actual Christmas day, my husband Warren says, Anne, where's your special necklace? And I said, well, I gave it to Betsy. I think she really needed it. So quietly in his way, he slips out and he goes to the Columbia Mall and he scours every store for that necklace. Keep in mind, between the time I was in 7th grade and an adult woman, the necklace had changed, right? They became flashing, you could turn them on, you could blink them, they would sing songs. Well, that's not the kind of necklace that I had. The necklace I had was strong, faithful, always there. Couldn't find it. Went upstairs to the mall, went to the pottery store, and he was telling the saleswoman the story about the necklace. And she said, "Here, take my necklace." So while to you this might just be a necklace, to me, this necklace represents faith and love and commitment from two important men in my life, my brother Leo and my husband Warren. I have to do this.
That was easy.
We have one more storyteller before our intermission. Feli. Felisola Carter says, "My life," but I need to turn that into your life, is in the public service, includes a career with the Social Security Administration, ongoing executive coaching with the Partnership for Public Service, and many years of engagement with Howard County organizations. She's proud of her Puerto Rican heritage and thrilled by her 41 years of marriage to Bruce W. Carter, and humbled by her sons, Robert and David. Please welcome Fedia.
Well, good evening. Thinking about a sense of place and a sense of feeling home proved to be a somewhat challenging assignment. I'm used to telling stories in my coaching work, but this was a little different. I had to think about this a little differently. So I started with my original place of home, and it was Puerto Rico. I was born in the town of Caguas, and I had an immediate sense of belonging because my last name happens to be Solá. My mother's name was Esteves, and in the Puerto Rican tradition, you use both surnames. And both were born themselves into families that were well-established, well-known, and in place. So my simple arrival meant that I had a place. I had a sense of belonging. We grew up in the town of Caguas. It was important to my parents to be in the center of town, so I lived many years at Calle Betances 31, number 31 Betances Street. What made that special is that we were 2 blocks from the literal center of town, but the actual center of the community. That's where the plaza was. Every town is laid out with the town square and the church. It was also within 2 blocks of where my parents worked and we could easily travel to each other. So that was the original sense of place and of home, Caguas, of course. And if you ever meet somebody from Puerto Rico, you know the first thing they ask is, where are you from? What town are you from? Those connections last. Moving forward, I went to college in New York. After college, I got my first job, which turned out to be my last job, working at the Social Security Administration. And it was at the Social Security Administration that by a wonderful coincidence, I got to meet my husband, Bruce. He was sent to my office by mistake. I confess, I didn't tell him that for many years. I was his training instructor when we started. Fabulous student. After we met and we fell in love, we married. And while he was originally from Maryland and had been living in New Jersey and other places in between, we chose that our married life would begin in Montclair, New Jersey. And we chose the town of Montclair because it was a vibrant community. It had integrated its school system using a very creative magnet program so that parents had full choice as to where the children went to school.
It had these lovely, small, older homes. And after scrounging all our pennies and then many more that were not ours that we borrowed, we bought our first house, a quaint 1920s small little home with lots of charm and enough to windows match. But it was a wonderful place to be, and it was there that we raised our 2 children. We started our family, we had 2 sons, and thinking that we would be there for some time, we had actually made lots of connections with the family, a circle of friends that became our family, because none of us had immediate family nearby. Mine was in Puerto Rico, Bruce's was in Maryland. And in fact, every time we came down for the summer or vacations, they would say, can't you get a transfer down here? There's a Social Security office up the road that looks pretty big. And we would always say, no, that's not what we do, you know. So moving fast forward, it is the summer of 1991. Our older son is 10, our younger son is 6. And we are in a situation where we have indeed both been offered some possibilities down here in Maryland. And after some consideration, we decide we're going to relocate. So the movers have come. It is our last day. We are packing up our 1986 Subaru wagon. We have both our sons just put in the car. Our 10-year-old son, who through the summer had become very excited and interested about being closer to the grandparents and life and so on, and we have been selling up all the kid stuff in Colombia, this fabulous place. As the date approaches, he developed all sorts of illnesses, and that particular day, he was sure he had a terrible fever. Our 6-year-old son, who had been equally excited, the instant we all got in the car, closed the doors, and turned on the engine, ready to pull out of the driveway at 17 Francis Place to head out, he burst into inconsolable tears. And he said, I'll never forget it, he said, how will Santa Claus ever find us? How will we know where we are if we are not on Francis Place in Columbia, in Montclair? Somehow we managed to drive to Maryland. We settled in Columbia for all the wonderful reasons that Columbia has to offer, which is so similar to what we had experienced in Montclair. We had been here about 1.5 years, feeling comfortable, getting settled, and it is Christmas. It was our second Christmas here, and I remember that I had actually splurged and get pre-printed envelopes with a little return address on them already, and I'm sending them off when in the incoming mail, not a Christmas card, but a notice from the Postal Service. You are now in Ellicott City, Maryland. You are now in zip code 21042. What? It's taken us a couple of years to get used to the idea we're in Columbia and get our kids acclimated, and all of a sudden, by a stroke of a pen from the Postal Service, we're in another city. What does that mean? When you think about a sense of place, what does that mean? Does that change how we think about ourselves? What is it? How do we explain to the rest of the world that we have not left, we haven't joined some secret organization, we're still in the same place? We got through that. A couple years later, we have another sense of place or out of place experience. Our older son comes home and advises us that he learned from his buddies that something called redistricting was going to happen. We didn't know what he was talking about, and then we too got our letter saying we are now going to a different high school. Not having experienced this previously, I set off to become informed, and after what seemed like countless, but it was actually 9 community meetings to learn about the school stuff, I came home one evening really stressed out, like, what are we gonna do? Will it be the loss of friends? Will it be the loss of neighbors? Will it be, what will happen? And my wonderful husband sits me down and very calmly says, Felly, I don't know what you're getting worked up about. It doesn't matter. Wherever our children are, we will be there. Wherever they are, we are home. It really doesn't matter. That proved to be absolutely true as they went on to complete their successful education. And they were so successful that they also developed an interest in life beyond the boundaries of Howard County, whatever town we call ourselves in, and have lived in many other places in the world. And our younger son, as part of his travels, ended up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he lived for some time and where he met the woman who would be the love of his life, the wonderful Sylvia. And he and Sylvia are now happily married. She is a German young lady, a wonderful architect, and they are expecting their first child. And so this December, our older son, who is now a resident of Chicago, Illinois, and us are bringing home with us when we all get together in Berlin, Germany for the December 21st birth of our first grandchild. Thank you.
So before we take an intermission, I want to turn back to those invitations. In being in these 6 stories so far this evening, noticing what's arising in you, a memory, a little story, some sense of place, sense of home. And then the curiosity about all the other folks in this room and their stories. And if you want to turn to a neighbor, maybe someone you don't know, say your name, and share a little story of what's arising for you around the sense of home. The room's gonna get really loud. Whoa, and really bright. I'm gonna ring these so that your partner can also tell you a couple-minute story of how they feel at home, if here's home, whatever that is for you. The room's gonna get, probably it's gonna stay loud and not listening to my bells. I'm gonna ring them again, and we can go in an intermission. So you can carry those stories on into our time before we come back and hear 6 more storytellers. So before you get loud, one more time. Someone you don't know so well, maybe saying your name, and a 2-minute story that's arising for you around sense of home. I'll ring the bell, and your partner will share a 2-minute story. So first, finding your partner, and first storyteller, beginning a story now. So I hope you got to hear and share at least one story during our intermission. We have 6 more stories this evening. The next one told by Bita. Bita Dehoff is a longtime resident of Howard County, proud mother of Alex and Angelica, and tries to be a good sister to her older siblings, despite the fact that they teased her quite a bit in childhood. Please invite Bita up.
January 1979. The newspaper headlines read, "Shaw is gone." There was a sea of people out in the streets, dancing and singing and raising the flag, celebrating. People who were in their cars, they were honking their horns and playing their music really loud and waving. It was a celebration of success, of freedom, from monarchy to democracy. A huge party, until it wasn't. It didn't really take long before chaos broke out, and the Mujahideen were out in the street with the guns in their backs and recruiting kids and teenagers to join their parties. And all other types of political parties were out and about, trying to recruit and fighting for power. So many of them that I had never even heard about. The Green Party, the Nationalist, the Monarchist, the Leftist, on and on and on. It was really too dangerous for kids to go to school, so they closed the schools down. And I was a teenager. I was good with that. So I was just hanging out with my friends and making new friends. Some of my new friends were the Mujahideen, who were teaching me about MS-13 and how to take it apart and how quickly put it together and timing us. And back then, in Tehran, was very westernized and everybody dressed very modernly, and I had this long black straight hair and always liked to dress well. But then one day I came home and I had this head covering on, and I started telling my parents that I needed to dress more modestly. Just a couple of weeks after that, my parents called me into the living room and said, "We're sending you to the United States to go to school, because, you know, the schools are out. We don't want you to fall behind. And this whole thing with the revolution is going to blow over in a couple of months. Everything will be back to normal, and you'll be back home." At that point, my brother was attending University of Martin, Tennessee, so it made sense for me to also come and go to Martin. Now, has anybody ever heard of Martin, Tennessee? Yeah, exactly. So in Iran, on TV back then, we basically had two channels, the American channel and the Iranian channel. And I always loved to tune into the American channel. I loved to watch the Disney cartoons and the movies, but I especially loved the Donnie and Marie Osmond show. A little bit of country, a little bit of rock and roll. So I thought to myself, Martin, Tennessee, a little bit of country, that's fantastic. You know, I know about this. And growing up, I had taken English starting in kindergarten, and actually in middle school, my English teacher was American, so I thought to myself, yeah, I speak English, so, you know, going to the country and I'll be fine. I can communicate with people. This is going to be wonderful for a couple of months. Well, Martin, Tennessee was not anything like Donnie and Marie depicted on TV. And the little English that I knew did not do me any good. I couldn't understand anything anybody was saying, and nobody could understand me. So it was interesting, to say the least. I was 13 years old when I came to the United States in 1979, and I had just finished middle school. And when I came here, I took this test, and the powers to be decided that I should be in 11th grade, a junior in high school. So, needless to say, the social scene in an American high school, even in Martin, Tennessee, is nothing like what I had experienced and what I'd seen. Boys and girls holding hands, kissing, public display of emotion, and being on the floor with their legs across one another. I didn't know what to do. I really didn't know, should I stare or should I avert my eyes? I stared. So, you know, when I was thinking about telling my story tonight, I figured this is a good point, this is a good time in the story to say, I made it through high school. I learned how to kiss. I went to college. I got married, have a family, and live happily ever after in Howard County, the most amazing place in the world. Then, drop the mic, go sit down, push that easy button. But that wouldn't be the entire story, obviously. I came to the United States on October 19th, 1979, and 2 short weeks later, the American hostage crisis took place. So it wasn't an easy time to be an Iranian in America, and it really hasn't been easy being an Iranian in America ever since. I don't know if you remember the song Barbara Ann by the Beach Boys. That used to be one of my most favorite songs until one day when I went to the high school cafeteria, I heard the kids chanting Bomb Bomb Iran to its tune. I don't like that song anymore. But all of those memories aside, life has been incredible. I am blessed to have a job I absolutely love and appreciate. I have friends whom I cherish. I have kids who are kind and giving and caring and supportive. And I had a husband whom I adored. When I graduated from high school, at that point, there were really only a handful of universities that accepted Iranian students. And West Virginia University was one of them. So I went from Tennessee to West Virginia. Woohoo! Party time. But that's where I met my husband. And so West Virginia really has a very, very special place in my heart, and I love it. And I am grateful to him and his family for embracing me at a time when Iranians were really outcasted. I had people who asked me to change my name from Bida to Rita because it was easier for them to say it. I have friends who refer to themselves as Persians versus Iranian because life is just easier that way. And I have friends whose names are all of a sudden Nancy and David and Brian versus Nastaran and Daryush and Bijan. So I think about what goes through somebody's heart and mind where they feel like they have to change their given name because of the political scene today. And how many of us truly have any control over where we're born, the family that we were born into, the religion that we were born into? How many of us have any control over what the government decides to do today and who they go to war with and who they call the axis of evil and who makes it into the ally column? Really, not many of us. So I took the opportunity of what had, I guess, the journey that I had traveled in my life, with my life really being turned upside down in a sense as a teenager because of the revolution in Iran, to really study what happened, what was the root cause of such an uprising, and understanding the danger of hopelessness, the danger of giving it your all and not getting anywhere, the danger of poverty, the horrible consequences when there is not a middle class, the consequences of having this huge, diverse space between the haves and the have-nots. And I took that information and I actually have created a life of service for myself, where I'm providing help to people who are low income, and who are struggling to make ends meet, and understanding the struggles that they have, and also advocating for equity and equality in life. We all want the same thing for our children. And I look at the decision that my parents made, and I'm so grateful to them for sending me to a country that stands for freedom and liberty. And I'm so thankful for being able to call America my home, and proud to call myself an Iranian American. Thank you.
Our next layer is brought by Graham Greeley. Graham Getty. Not Graham Greeley, who I went to college with. Graham Getty. Former monk, bartender, Southerner, and divinity school dropout. Current data geek, father, and preacher's wife. Graham Getty lives in Columbia, Maryland with his spouse, 2 daughters, rescue dog, and the persistent belief that we must do better. Please welcome Graham up.
So here's the thing. The 22-foot canary yellow Penske moving truck is a good deal. I know it's a good deal because Mitch at Savannah Movers had told us it's a good deal 5 times. Because when my wife and I, Paige, showed up to get our guaranteed to be there 10-foot moving truck, none was to be found. So the guys are hooking up the car carrier to put our 1996 already packed to the gills family hand-me-down Ford Explorer on the back. So what was going to be about a 24-foot behemoth is now 40 feet. And Mitch has also kindly explained to me that because my wife made the reservation and it's in her credit card, she is the only one allowed to drive this thing up 95, unless, of course, we want to pay almost double. I'm a little upset. I'm a little angry, and we haven't even loaded the truck, right? So I kind of make peace a little bit in my mind with Mitch, and we get the truck loaded, and I'm in our relatively new 2003 Toyota Corolla, following my wife in the 40-foot behemoth. And if I weren't already secure with my masculinity before we got on Interstate 95, I certainly knew I was going to be after. Because we were headed here. We were headed to Columbia, Maryland. And a couple hours in, my upset with Mitch, rightly or wrongly, started to transfer over to my beloved wife. Because I don't know if all of you know this, but my wife's kind of awesome. And she was a little bit of a big deal. And so we kind of had our choice as to what Unitarian congregation she was going to serve. There was one in Vancouver that was courting. There were a couple in Northern California. There was one in New Zealand. So when she said, honey, we're going to Maryland. We're going to Columbia. I was like, all right, really? So even back then in 2003, early adopter that I am, I went on the Google and I put in Columbia, Maryland. And the first thing that comes up, of course, Plan City. And I closed the laptop. Because I'm from the Deep South, right? And the Deep South is a great place to be from, in my opinion. Because where I grew up, Plan City was code for gated community, and you only needed one line of barbed wire, 2 guys, preferably with the AR-15s, to keep out all the undesirables. But I'm thinking maybe this is what happens when you grow up, right? Women have been following men to their careers all over this country. This is your turn. This is what you agreed to do. Shut up, drive the Corolla, go to Columbia. So I'm having this argument with myself, I'm praying that Paige and the 40-foot behemoth don't go off the road. And 10 hours later, we pull up to 7435 Hickory Log Circle in the village of Owen Brown in the townhouse that the congregation has found for us. And we're not even 2 boxes out, right? And our immediate next door neighbor comes bounding out, big smile, 6'4", 250, African-American man, like Sean. He says, hey, I would totally help you. My name's Sean, this is my wife Alice. We would totally help you get this truck unloaded, but I'm late. I got to go to my shift in DC, and he's in a full police uniform. And I'm like, okay. And then his wife comes out a few later, white. I'm like, oh, maybe this isn't going to be this vanilla milquetoast town that I feared. Maybe things are going to be okay. So we keep unloading the car, and a couple hours go later, we order pizza because that's what you do. And our next set of neighbors comes home, and they're Nigerian. I'm like, wow, okay. Now, I hadn't done my due diligence, right? I shut the laptop. I didn't know about Columbia. So we get the truck like 3/4 of the way unloaded, and our third set of neighbors come home, and they're South Asian. And at this point, I start looking for the candid camera, right? Because this place doesn't exist. Even in the big cities, people stick to themselves. They don't, this is not possible, right? But of course, I come to find out and come to love, like, the actual diversity that is in Columbia and in Howard County, right? You walk around the lakes, Centennial, up here, doesn't matter. You hear and meet people from everywhere. And I'm just so thrilled because in my life, when I was 7 years old, back in the Deep South, just for context, I was playing with my friend Tony Knox, African-American, right? Tony's family didn't have a lot of money, houses on the wrong side of the tracks, which matters not at all to 2 7-year-old boys. Except that day, my mother's father, Duncan Borneman, Pop, happened to be in the car. He was visiting. So they pull up in the Malibu Classic station wagon, and I pop in, and I immediately sense something's wrong, right? And as we start to drive away, my grandfather declares, as nastily as he can, "I've never seen so many black people." And of course, he doesn't say black people. And I start crying. My mother's uncomfortable. He turns around, he glances, he sees me. And so he turns around and explains to me, "Hey, cut that out. Boys don't do that. Man up," right? Which, of course, makes the crying worse. Makes my mother more uncomfortable, makes the drive even longer. And even he, right, in his attempt to console me, he like puts his hand behind the handrest of my mom so that he can get the right leverage to turn himself, to make eye contact with me. And his words of consolation to his grandson are, "Graham, don't misunderstand me. I don't mean that there are not any good black people in the world. There just aren't enough of them to make a difference." And I just start bawling, right? And some nonverbal, wiser than I deserve to be 7-year-old part of me promised myself I was getting out of here. This was not going to be my thing. So to get on that roller coaster ride, going from thinking I had sort of betrayed that to coming here and coming to love and understand Rouse's vision that you can't force community on people, but you can at least put in an infrastructure that makes community more likely. You can give everybody a community mailbox. You can put people at an interfaith center, right? It was such a relief. And I kind of felt proud of it. But it wasn't until years later, I was coming back from a conference and the flight was delayed and everybody was angry, and travelers start doing the small talk thing that travelers do. And somebody says, "So, hey, where are you going?" And without missing a beat, I was like, "Oh, I'm headed home." And he's like, "Oh, where's home?" And it was that question, it was that moment that I realized something had changed in me, right? That home was now clearly Columbia. And so I paused and I said, "Okay, yeah, I'm headed home. It's Columbia, Maryland. It's the small town." And he interrupts me and he says, "Oh, yeah. That's that planned city, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it is. Let me tell you what that means."
Our next story is by Woody Merkel, who is not related to the guy in this picture, but we were wondering earlier. Woody, you may have seen around the Conservancy. He's a lifelong resident of Howard County, married with 2 children, 1 grandchild, retired from state government, and currently volunteers as a naturalist here and for other nonprofits. Please invite Woody up.
Well, Lee, you promised me being in the second group would be a lot easier, and you lied. Wow, what great stories. This is going to be tough to follow. But I'm going to break one of the rules of storytelling that Lee told us about and start out by saying, once upon a time, there was a river, the Patapsco River. It's about a mile from here as the crow flies, and it defines the northern border of Howard County. Its headwaters are fed by streams from Baltimore, Carroll, Frederick, and Howard County. Back before the Europeans came, the river was surrounded by the great eastern forests. It was said that a squirrel could hop from tree to tree, from here to the Mississippi River, and never touch the ground. The Patapsco ran clear and clean and cold. It was home to many fish, including the brook trout. The brook trout being the native trout of the East. It's one of the most beautiful fish you'll want to see. In its mating colors, its back is dark green with gold and red spots. The green changes to blood red orange along its sides and fins, and the fins are edged in white. Now, the brook trout needs the cleanest, coldest water to survive in and to reproduce. It's considered an indicator species. That means if you have brook trout in your stream or river, you have extremely high quality water. My parents' family and their families lived here in the Woodstock area. I still live here with my family right across the street on a piece of the property owned by my grandparents. My father's family was from Granite, and Granite's actually a small town right on the Baltimore County side of the river, connected to Woodstock, but divided from Woodstock by the river. So if you're on the Harry County side, you're a Woodstockian. If you're on the Baltimore County side, you're a Granite. And they two don't meet too much. My grandfather on the father's side worked in the granite quarries there. My mother's family was from here in Woodstock. They were friends and neighbors of the Browns of Mount Pleasant. My great-grandfather owned a general store down the hill in Woodstock near the railroad station. Neither one of those structures are there anymore. My grandmother would tell us stories as children of how they would cut ice off of the river and bring it up to the ice house at the general store. The ice house was built into the side of the hill and would be used to keep perishable items, cool and keep them from spoiling during the warm summer months. By then, the brook trout was long gone. The Great Eastern Forest had been cut for lumber for building, for fuel, and to make room for agricultural land. I've always loved water, and I've always loved fishing. My mom always said there's not a stream or a pond around the region here that I hadn't fallen into at some point. My father used to take my brother and my sister and I down to the Patapsco to fish. And that was my first exposure and experience to the sport. The best access to the Patapsco here at Woodstock is actually on the Granite side of the river. And there, on the top of the hill overlooking the river, sat the Jesuit seminary. The Jesuits owned hundreds of acres up and down the Patapsco Valley here, and they had groomed walking trails, gazebos, and swinging bridges that crossed the river, and they were open to everybody to use. To get to our fishing spot on the Patapsco, we had to cross a small stream that came down the hill from the seminary. The water in the stream smelled really bad, and it was full of green and brown algae. Turns out that little stream was receiving some of the effluent from the sewage treatment facility for the seminary. To put it politely, sewage treatment in the 1950s is not what it is today. We called the stream Turd Run. And I can still remember my father picking us up and carrying us across the river, across the small stream so we wouldn't come in contact with the water and get deathly sick. We would walk upriver from the stream until we came to a spot in the river where there was a big flat rock along the edge of the river. And we would fish using bobbers and worms. My poor dad spent most of his time straightening out tangles in our lines and removing our lines from trees and bushes along the side of the river. And if you've ever taken a young kid fishing, you know that's what you do. We would catch an occasional catfish or sunfish, both species that could tolerate the warmer and murkier waters that the Patapsco had become. I continued fishing the Patapsco into my early teen years with friends until we discovered junior and high school sports and girls, not necessarily in that order. But I never caught a trout there. We would catch bass and some sunfish, but we always had a good time. About a year ago, I returned to fish the Patapsco with my brother and a friend of his who was visiting from out of town. We walked about a mile downstream from the Woodstock Bridge to an area of rapids on the river. The rapids had been created by an old stone bridge that crossed the river at that point and provided access for a spur railroad line that went from the main rail line on the Harry County side to a granite quarry on the Baltimore County side. But it had long since fallen down, and the rocks had fallen into the river. It was a great set of rapids. It was a nice place to fish. It was a warm, sunny day in late May, and we were hoping just to catch a smallmouth bass or two. Well, the fishing for the day was really great. The catching was not so great. But then I hooked a fish. I could tell by the bend in my fly rod that it was a really nice fish. And it was an epic battle. Visions of Spencer Tracy and the Old Man in the Sea flashed through my eyes. It wasn't quite that epic. But the fish was a good fish, and it took me a few minutes to bring him in. And I was anticipating that, boy, this is going to be a really nice smallmouth bass because of the fight it had put up. But as I brought it into my boot, it wasn't a bass at all. It was a trout. It was a rainbow trout. Wow. A rainbow trout on the Patapsco River, late May, warm day, it doesn't compute. Now, truth be told, the rainbow trout is a non-native trout of the East. The Department of Natural Resources for years has raised and stocked rainbow trout in the rivers around the state, including the Patapsco, with the expectation that fishermen will catch these fish in the early spring while the rivers are still cold enough to support them, and by the time the summer months hit, the fish will be taken out and gone. So I removed my fly from the fish's mouth and returned it to the river. I think, though, that we can see the catching of the trout, even though it was a rainbow trout, as a hopeful sign. But the question is, will the quality of the water in the river continue to improve? Will the brook trout ever have an opportunity to come home? Thanks.
Now that we've added Turd Run to our geography of the place and visions of brook trout for the future, we're going to add our next layer from Elaine Reed, a New York transplant. Elaine has lived in Maryland since '71 and in Columbia since '72. She's retired from the public school system after 30 years of teaching and has 4 children, 9 grandchildren, who all live close by and provide a lot of joy in her life. Please invite Elaine up.
I want to transport you to a different time and place. We're back in the 60s, New York City, place where I was born and raised. The best place in the world. I was 10 years old, going on the subway into Manhattan, walking up and down Broadway, 99 cents for the matinee at Radio City Music Hall. There would be like tables all along Broadway, Fifth Avenue. You can buy anything from, a hat, a scarf, very expensive watch, Rolex, I swear it's real. Going to a pizzeria, because what's going into Manhattan without topping it off with a pizzeria? 15 cents a slice, 2 slices, and a Coke for 40 cents. Now, New York pizza, sorry, I just turned myself off. New York pizza, it's large, it's greasy, and it's delicious. And you take it and you fold it and you try and eat it to make sure you didn't drop any of it on your shirt, because that's a telltale sign when you go home and your mother has to wash your clothes. So it was awesome. Now, 1964, New York City World's Fair, Flushing Meadow Park in Queens. It was just 2 subway rides, 1 transfer from the Bronx, where I am, into Queens, and I would walk along the World's Fair, and I'd see exhibits from different countries, and I remember specifically the GE Pavilion. It showed us a representation of what life was going to be like in the future. There was a nice family sitting on a sofa, looking at a TV screen, talking to another family in space. Oh my goodness. They didn't have anything to hold up to their ear. There was no wire that was connected to a wall. They were just talking to somebody up there. 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. It was just 5 years later, and we're watching it from our living rooms. Richard Nixon was president. Vietnam War was raging. The country is mourning over several assassinations. And it was tough. But on the other side, on the bright side, the New York Mets won the World Series over the Baltimore Orioles. Come on, let's hear it. Nobody. The New York Jets won the Super Bowl over the Baltimore Colts. Okay, that's a little bit more. The New York Knicks beat the Baltimore Bullets, winning whatever it is you win when you're playing basketball. Yay. 400,000 people descend upon a little farm in Woodstock and have the most monumental history-making concert ever. I heard about it on the news because my mother wouldn't let me go. Are you kidding? But it happened. So that was a really hopping place. It was a good place to live in 1969. But as the Beatles prepared to perform their last song together, I prepared to meet the love of my life, Alan, for the first time. Now, it was a setup. He liked to call it a conspiracy. And it was between my mother and his grandfather. We had relatives who came over on the boat from Vilcaccia, Austria together. And we were set up. He says, you know, have I got a grandson for you? And I'm like, But it was not necessarily love at first sight for me, but it was love that long lasted. And in 1971, when I was young, I was very young, I had one more year left in college, and he had just graduated from Kings Point Merchant Marine Academy the week before. We got married. We packed up our fire engine red Volkswagen Beetle, class, and we drove down the New Jersey Turnpike to our first home in Maryland. And it was Laurel. Now, can a loyal New Yorker find happiness in Laurel, Maryland? Well, let me tell you why we settled in Laurel, and then you get a little bit more of the picture. So, you know, rents in College Park, where I was in school, was very expensive. And rents in Greenbelt, where he worked for the Department of the Navy, was very expensive. And, you know, gas was 35 cents a gallon, and rent was $150 a month. It drained the budget. We could only afford Laurel. But our decision to leave Laurel came after a discussion with one of my neighbors, and she asked me where my Christmas tree was, and I said, I don't celebrate Christmas, I celebrate Hanukkah. And she looked at me and she said, oh, but you're so nice. So Alan and I decided we wanted to live in a place where we are valued for who we are, not what we are. And we heard about, you know, the new planned community that James Rouse was making, and his philosophy was, the purpose of civilization is to make better people, and we decided we wanted to live among better people. So in 1972, we didn't last very long in Laurel, we moved to Columbia, and we set down roots. And, you know, Columbia in 1972 was only 5 years old. So if you were older than 5, you came from somewhere else. So everybody who was here, who were my contemporaries, came from somewhere else. And not surprisingly, I guess, many of them came from New York. They sound just like me. And I was afraid my kids were going to grow up saying awesome, like they do, but only to tease me. So everyone was from someplace else, and we formed a community. And as Columbia grew, my community grew. We would meet in the summer, and we would go to the pools, and we would meet at the roller skating rink for the fall and the spring, and then there was always ice skating in the winter. And we loved to walk around the lake and the bike paths, and I really came to appreciate and love the serenity of suburbia. But being a loyal New Yorker, you know, we used to go back several times a year, holidays, vacations, summer. So I'm thinking, to my best recollection, it actually happened November 1984, Thanksgiving. We're driving the minivan up the New Jersey Turnpike. We cross over the bridge to the Belt Parkway, and we're in Brooklyn. And the kids are complaining. The 4 kids in the back of the minivan, why isn't this car moving? Why isn't that car moving? What about that car over there? Mommy, why does that man have his middle finger up at us? No, that's the way they say hello in Brooklyn. We use 5 fingers. And suddenly this whole, you know, my trip, my anticipated joy of going back to New York kind of faded. I missed my community. I missed my connections, because the family, you can have a family and you can have a family of friends. So as we passed Coney Island, I'm thinking, no. From Coney Island to the JFK airport was just 17 miles away, but a full 2 hours later, I realized that on this trip home, it hit me. I was not returning home. I left it 8 hours ago. Thank you for traveling down memory lane with me.
Our next layer is brought by John Shoemaker, a longtime resident of the historic district of Ellicott City. He, his wife, and 1-year-old son currently live in an old mill on the banks of the Hudson Branch next to the culvert at Ellicott Mills Drive that washed away in the flood of 2018. Please welcome John up this evening.
So, as she said, I'm John Shoemaker. My family owns Shoemaker Country on Main Street in Ellicott City. My history going back on Main Street goes back to actually right before that I was born. My parents had actually opened a shop on Main Street in 1969, I believe it was. And they were there when the first flood hit, or Agnes hit. That was the first one that we experienced in 1972. A couple months later, I was born. So there was quite a few things that happened to my family that year. Fast forward to 2001, my parents decided to open another shop on Main Street. They had been dabbling in antiques for many years, and they felt it was the right time to open a shop on Main Street. I would go in and help out at the store, and it eventually started to take off. We experienced a moderate amount of success, and the opportunity arose for us to add a second building in 2003. I went full-time. My brother joined us shortly thereafter, and we all worked really hard, not always well, but we worked really hard together to make a go of it. The first flood that I really experienced, actually being there, was in 2011. We were told that it was the first time that a flood was a top-down flood as opposed to a bottom-up. I didn't exactly know what that meant, but that the water came down from above rather than up from the Patapsco. The building that we had taken where we worked every day spanned the Tiber. And I do remember that day noticing something very different. I'm standing at the store counter. My brother and my dad are upstairs, and we, by this time, have really started to make furniture, so I'm used to hearing a lot of banging and noises from upstairs. But that was the first time that I remember standing at the counter and feeling the banging of the debris underneath the concrete floor that spanned the river. And I thought this was really going to be bad. Fortunately for us, we fared fairly well. We had a couple of inches of water in the foyer. And I guess after the horrible stories about Agnes and how well we did in Agnes and how well we survived 2011, I sort of got this feeling of being, I don't know, blessed or lucky or invincible, I guess, is more like the word. We continued on for a number of years, feeling like, well, we had survived. We were in a good spot. And until 2016. There was a Saturday morning, and my wife and I like to go canoeing a lot. Whenever we get some free time, we enjoy going in on the Patapsco and the Daniels area, and it's quite nice. So I woke up that morning, and I made the coffee, and then I started packing up all the gear and loading the canoe. And then I walked in, and I woke up my wife, and I tried to convince her that it would be a good day to go canoeing. We went out, we enjoyed the day, and as the day kind of went along, we started to notice that the clouds were gathering, so we figured it would be a good time to get back, get all the gear packed up, and get home before the rain started. We got everything back in the truck, and we drove back home, and as it started to rain as we were driving home, we got back, and we made a mad dash to get inside the door as the rain really started to come down quite heavily. We figured we wouldn't be going anywhere, so we opened a bottle of wine, and we sat, and we watched the water in the street, and we thought, wow, this is going to be a pretty serious storm. This is quite one. So we watched. In our house, I don't know if I had mentioned it, but we overlooked the Hudson branch, which empties into the Tiber. And I thought, man, I tell you what, I should really wander back and take a look at the backside of the house. At that point, when I walked back, it had started to get dark, but I realized that the river had actually risen probably about 17 feet at that point. The creek that you could almost jump across had gone as far as you could see, probably 25 or 30 feet across. And I thought, this is pretty serious. This is really, really bad. This isn't just like watch it. We need to make sure we can figure out what to do and get out. At that moment, I realized we have a room on the first floor. We had this beautiful room. It was a big bank of windows, and it was like an extra living room. We would go down there and watch movies, enjoy the river, and it was a nice spot. And I remember I thought, maybe I should go down there and just start bringing up a few things before this possibly starts to leak under the door. I went down. I grabbed an armload of things. I don't even remember what they were, not the most valuable things down there. Returned upstairs so that I could go back down and get more things. At that moment, I heard that crack. The door broke in half, and the room began to fill. It filled quickly to 4 feet, probably within about a minute and a half. I didn't know how to tell my wife that her sofa and chair were down there, and I didn't think I could rescue it in time, so we watched. We stood there. I said, it might be a good time to gather up the important papers, just in case we have to make get out of the house. So we both stood there, glass of wine, important papers under our arms, top of the steps, watching, step by step, as the water continued to rise. It rose over 7 feet in the house. It stopped. It seemed like forever. That moment when the water slowed to the point where it didn't rise anymore, and then it started to descend the steps. I thought this would be pretty good. We sat there and watched as the sofa went by. The chair went by. The television went by. My beloved beer fridge floated by. That poor thing worked to the last minute. After the water receded, we went down because all the wine had been drunk upstairs, and there was still cold beer in it. I thought that might have been the end of it, but it was really just the beginning. We walked outside to survey the damage, not knowing what was happening further down the street, and we turned to look, and it looked like people returning from the front lines of the battle. There were people soaking wet. They looked shell-shocked, no shoes, missing bags. They didn't know where to go. They were just told to walk up the street. We couldn't take everybody in, so we just started grabbing the few that we knew coming up the street. We brought them in. We shared the beer until it was gone. We let them take showers, and we gave them clothes. It was the beginning of a year-long struggle to get back on our feet because the same thing had happened at our store. We had over 6 feet of water down there. The damages were probably close to $500,000. We survived. We got back on our feet. We were told it was only going to be a once-in-a-lifetime. You'd be proud to tell your kids and your grandchildren that you survived, you saw it, and you survived. As you all know, that's not the last of the flood. In 2018, we suffered another flood, equal amount of damage. We were forced to take our business, our beloved business off of Main Street. We'd been there since 2001. It had been 17 years, and we called it home. We moved it. It feels like a million miles away. It's only at the old Will Hyde's building up on Old Columbia Road, but it feels a long way. We still live at the house, and I'll tell you, after the last flood, the culvert at Ellicott Mills Drive washed away, and every morning we sit there at 7:15 as the heavy equipment pours into the culvert, and the boom, boom, boom of the jackhammers and the drills start, and we start to try to figure out how can we keep our home? How can we stay here? And it's so hard to give up that sense of community.
Our final story this evening is by Wendy Ng. She spent 18 and a half years in Hong Kong, moved on to 3.5 years in New York City, settled for 25 years in Rochester, New York, and then most recently meandered for 17 years to Elkridge, Maryland. During that time, she went from arts to the sciences and then back again to arts. She is retired from the field of pharmacology, not pharmacy, graphic design, homeschooling, and teaching. She's now focused on being an artist. Please welcome Wendy up.
Those were tough acts to follow. A sense of home. My first feeling of home in Howard County happened when I was living in Rochester, New York. It was 1976. And it would be another 25 years before we moved into Maryland. I was a first-year graduate student, a foreign student, living on $3,000 a year stipend. And I had just came to the conclusion that I was just too foreign, too Western for most Chinese folks, and definitely too Chinese for most American folks. But one evening after a simple dinner of Chinese noodle soup, and before I started on my evening of quiet study, it hit me that I would be perfectly okay living as a single woman in pursuit of a research career. So as I was settling into this unfettered life, an American graduate student from Elkridge, Maryland, was hanging around a lot in my classes and in my left sessions. He owns a '69 Valiant, a white car with rust trim. I didn't have a car, so for study breaks, he kindly offers to give me rides. So we would go and see free plays for volunteering as an usher, and we would go to attend the Philharmonic at half price for student tickets. We had our fill of movies at $1 a ticket for students, and we play bridge with our graduate student friends, sometimes into the wee hours of the night. So after 4 months of study breaks, we decided to make a go of it and get married. Now, we would give up the leases. We won't renew our 2 leases for our graduate student apartments, and we would live off campus. As it turns out, we were really lucky. We found an apartment fairly quickly. It was a 2-bedroom affair. Well, mostly, it's almost like a 1.5 room apartment. And it turned out to be so poorly insulated that in subsequent winters, when we put up visqueen plastic sheeting, it would billow into the room like spinnakers. But it has a full-size refrigerator and an area where we can actually sit down with a regular dining room table to eat. But the best thing is actually we can walk to the medical center. It's only a 1/4 mile to the place where we spend most of our time studying and doing research. So life was good. We decided that we would both write separately to our parents to say we have found a wonderful unfurnished apartment and it would be big enough for when we get married. And we had planned on getting married at the end of the year, close to Christmas time when most families and friends would be home. We had it all figured out. If it's late at night and phone calls come in, I would answer it. It would be most likely a phone call from overseas when my mother was living in Hong Kong, or a long-distance phone call from Seattle, Washington, where my 2 sisters were. Earlier in the evening, he would take the calls because likely it would be from his parents from Maryland. Simple, we got it figured out. We were all set. Then his parents wrote and said, "We would love to help you move in and bring you extra furniture from the house. What do you do?" So that evening we sat in the kitchenette facing that painted concrete block wall, discussing what to do. Well, I didn't know his parents well. We met only once, the prior Memorial Day weekend for 2 days. They were conservative and demonstrative family, and I was from a culture where hugging and kisses is not exactly what you do when you meet strangers. So it was kind of a strange, uncomfortable first meeting as we stand in the driveway figuring out who we each were. And I wondered what they would think. So we called them and said, "Thank you for your offer to help. Love to have the furniture, but if you're driving 8 hours up here, why don't you come up and be witnesses to our wedding?" So they came, and on a beautiful July morning, late July, beautiful weather in Rochester, we were married in a judge's chamber in the courthouse. I had he had on his only one and only suit, and I had on a cotton outfit, a beige color short sleeve V-neck top, and one of those Indian printed wrap skirt, red because it was a celebratory color for Chinese cultures. And we were then we would drive home after the wedding and sitting in the car, thinking about moving the furniture into the house. It would be a long, tired day. And then I turned around and said to them, you know, if we were in Hong Kong, I should be calling you guys as Lo Ye and Nai Nai. And I didn't think that they would understand the significance of the honorific, nor would they be able to pronounce it. So I looked at them and I said, may I call you Mom and Dad, just like he does? They said, yes. And I was home.
Thank you, Wendy. Can we have another round of applause for our courageous and generous storytellers this evening? Thank you for filling this room and filling us with your tales. And if you'll permit me, something I've been thinking about this year and these months, the month working together, is a different twist on stories for me. In a culture where many of us end up maybe somewhere different than where we started, where our lives can be quite independent with personal assistance on our different gadgets and our ability to kind of go about our day on our own, and with less necessity to be connected to the land. I keep coming back to how knowing the story of what happened where we stand before we stand here, and knowing the stories of those we find ourselves in community with, seems really important in caring for and understanding that sense of place so that we can take care of this land and take care of each other. So tonight it fills me even more so with that significance that you are a community that shows up to hear each other's stories and wants more. So thank you for being here so that these stories could jump with all of us together. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ned. Thanks.
I would like to thank our sponsors one more time, and that's the Department of Recs and Parks, Columbia Association, and Remax Realty. So thank you all for that. I guess the last thing I'd like to do is just once again is thank you as an audience for coming, thank the storytellers, thank the Conservancy, and thank you, Lee, for running this today. Good night. Thank you.